Dad abandoned me after Mom's death. Years later, I recorded his shocking confession. 4 years ago, my life changed forever when my mom suddenly passed away. I was only 17 at the time, and within weeks of her death, my dad completely abandoned me. What made it worse was that he didn't just leave, he blamed me for her death. My mom had been driving to pick me up from a friend's house when she got into the fatal accident. Growing up, we were what most people would consider a normal, happy family. My mom was a marketing executive at a large company, and my dad worked in the same company but in a different department. They both had successful careers, and we lived comfortably in a nice suburban house. My mom was my best friend. She was the kind of person who could light up a room with her smile and make everyone feel special. She always made time for me despite her busy schedule, and we had weekly mother-daughter dates where we'd try new restaurants or go shopping together. My dad was different, not as warm as Mom, but still caring in his own way. He was more focused on providing for the family and making sure I had everything I needed for a good future. He wasn't the type to show much emotion, but I never doubted that he loved me. At least, that's what I thought back then. The night everything changed started like any other Friday. I was at my best friend Emily's house, studying for our upcoming finals. We lost track of time, and suddenly it was 10 p.m. Emily's parents weren't home, and she couldn't drive me because she had taken some cold medicine. I called my mom, feeling guilty because I knew she had a long day at work, but she immediately agreed to pick me up. That was just how she was, always putting everyone else first. It was raining that night, and the roads were slick. Mom was only 10 minutes away from Emily's house when it happened. According to the police report, her car hit a wet patch on the road, spun out of control, and crashed into a tree. She died instantly. The police officer who came to our door said she probably didn't suffer, as if that was supposed to make it better somehow. The first few days after Mom's death were a blur of relatives, funeral arrangements, and casseroles from neighbors. My dad seemed to be handling it as well as could be expected, staying busy with all the arrangements and paperwork. But once the funeral was over and everyone went back to their lives, something in him changed. It started with small things. He stopped eating dinner with me. He wouldn't look me in the eye. If I walked into a room, he would find a reason to leave. Then the drinking started. He would come home late, reeking of alcohol, and sometimes I would hear him crying in their bedroom, Mom's side of the bed still untouched. About a week after the funeral, he started making comments. At first, they were subtle, sighing heavily when I asked him something, muttering under his breath when I walked by. Then one night, after several drinks, he finally said what he had been thinking. He looked at me with such hatred in his eyes and said, "If you hadn't called her that night, she would still be here. You killed her." Those words broke something between us. I tried to apologize, tried to explain that I didn't know this would happen, but he wouldn't hear it. Every day after that, he found new ways to blame me. If I made breakfast, he would say Mom used to make it better. If I was watching TV, he would say I was being disrespectful to her memory by acting like everything was normal. It was like he couldn't stand the sight of me anymore. 3 weeks after the funeral, I came home from school to find half the house empty. Dad had packed up all his things while I was gone. There was a note on the kitchen counter that said, "I can't do this anymore. Looking at you reminds me too much of her and what happened. I've arranged for your grandparents to take care of you. Don't try to contact me." I collapsed right there in the kitchen. My mom was dead, and now my dad was abandoning me too. My grandparents, Mom's parents, came over as soon as I called them. They were horrified by what my dad had done. My grandmother held me while I cried, and my grandfather immediately started making arrangements to become my legal guardian. My grandparents were amazing. They moved me into their house, helped me finish my last year of high school, and supported me through the college application process. My grandfather, who had done well in real estate, even paid for my entire college education. They became the parents I needed during those difficult years. For 4 years, my dad made absolutely no attempt to contact me. No birthday cards, no Christmas wishes, nothing. Through cousins and family friends, I learned that he had moved to a different city and gotten remarried to a wealthy woman named Sarah. Apparently, he was living this whole new life while I was trying to piece myself back together. I threw myself into my studies, graduated college with honors in computer science, and landed a great job at a tech company. My grandparents were so proud of me, and I was finally starting to feel like I had a future again. I even started dating someone, a nice guy from work who knows my whole story and has been incredibly understanding about my trust issues. Then last month, out of nowhere, my dad reached out through LinkedIn. His message seemed casual, as if he hadn't just abandoned me for 4 years. He said he had been doing a lot of thinking lately and wanted to reconnect. He asked if we could meet for dinner at his new home with his wife Sarah. At first, I ignored the message. I had worked too hard to get to a good place in my life, and I didn't want to risk opening old wounds. But then he started calling my grandparents, telling them how much he regretted his actions and how he wanted to make things right. My grandmother, who has always believed in second chances, encouraged me to hear him out. She said people can change and that maybe he had finally worked through his grief. My grandfather was more skeptical, but he said the decision was mine to make. Against my better judgment, I agreed to have dinner with him and Sarah. That's how I found myself standing in front of their mansion last week. Yes, an actual mansion. Sarah clearly came from money. The house was enormous, with expensive artwork on every wall and furniture that probably cost more than my yearly salary. Sarah seemed nice enough, though a bit awkward around me. My dad was trying too hard to be casual, as if the last 4 years hadn't happened. During dinner, I excused myself to use the bathroom. As I was walking back, I heard voices coming from my dad's study. The door was slightly ajar, and I could hear him talking to Sarah. What I heard next made my blood run cold. My dad was telling Sarah that he couldn't stand being around me because I reminded him too much of my mom. But that wasn't the shocking part. He then said something that made me pull out my phone and start recording. He confessed that my mom's death wasn't entirely an accident. Apparently, they had been having huge fights because he had been having an affair with Sarah for months before mom's death. Mom had found out about the affair just days before the accident, and they had a massive fight the night she died. She was distracted and upset because of their fight when she was driving to pick me up. All these years, he had blamed me for mom's death when his affair had played a huge role in it. I kept recording as he told Sarah that the only reason he was trying to reconnect with me now was because my grandfather had recently changed his will. Apparently, my grandfather had built up quite a fortune over the years through his real estate investments, and he was planning to leave everything to me instead of my dad because of how my dad had abandoned me. I couldn't listen anymore. I quietly left the house, ignoring my dad's calls asking where I was going. The next day, I played the recording for my grandparents. My grandfather was livid. He confirmed that he had indeed changed his will to make me his sole heir, but he hadn't told anyone except my grandmother. He was shocked that my dad had somehow found out. That's why I'm here now. My dad has been calling and texting nonstop, threatening to ruin my life if I don't convince my grandfather to change his will back. He's claiming that I invaded his privacy by recording his conversation and that I'm trying to steal his inheritance. Ida for recording the conversation and showing it to my grandparents? Update 1. It's been 2 weeks since my original post, and I want to thank everyone for their supportive comments and messages. The situation has gotten even more complicated, and I need to get this off my chest. After I showed the recording to my grandparents, my grandfather decided he wanted to confront my dad directly. He's always been the type of person who believes in handling things face to face rather than letting them fester. My grandmother tried to talk him out of it, worried it would just make things worse, but he was adamant. He said he needed to look my dad in the eye and understand how he could betray his family like this. My grandfather called my dad and told him to come to their house last Sunday. He didn't tell him that I would be there too, or that we had the recording. I was nervous about seeing my dad again, especially after how I left things at the dinner, but my grandparents assured me they wouldn't let him manipulate or intimidate me. When my dad arrived, he looked surprised to see me there. He started making excuses about why I had left the dinner so abruptly, claiming I had misunderstood something. My grandfather let him talk for a few minutes, and I could see him getting angrier with each word. Finally, without saying anything, my grandfather pulled out his phone and played the recording. The color drained from my dad's face as he heard his own voice talking about the affair and mom's death. For a moment, there was complete silence in the room. Then, something unexpected happened. Instead of denying it or getting angry, my dad just broke down. He collapsed into a chair and started sobbing, not the quiet, dignified kind of crying, but deep, gut-wrenching sobs that made him look like a completely different person from the confident man I'd seen at dinner. What came next was like watching a dam break. He started confessing everything, and each revelation was worse than the last. The affair with Sarah hadn't started just months before mom's death as he'd said in the recording, it had been going on for almost a year. Sarah wasn't just some woman he met randomly, she was mom's colleague at work. They had met at the company's holiday party where mom had actually introduced them. The affair started with innocent lunches, then late meetings, and eventually full-blown hotel stays. What made it even more twisted was that Sarah had been at our house several times for dinner parties mom hosted, sitting at our table, eating mom's cooking, all while having an affair with dad. But the most shocking part came when he revealed how mom had discovered the affair. It wasn't by accident or through suspicious behavior. Sarah's ex-husband had contacted mom directly. Apparently, Sarah had a history of going after married men with money. She would get involved with them, break up their marriages, and then move on to her next target. Her ex-husband had recognized the pattern when he saw dad's name come up on Sarah's phone bill repeatedly, and he felt guilty enough to warn mom. Mom had confronted dad about it the morning of her accident. They had a huge fight where mom threatened to expose both of them at their workplace. Dad admitted that he had been cruel to her during that fight, telling her that she was boring, that she had let herself go, that Sarah understood him better. Mom had been crying when she left for work that morning. That's why she was so distracted when she was driving to pick me up, not just because she was tired from work, but because her whole world had been shattered that morning. The affair had directly contributed to her state of mind when she got behind the wheel. Dad was still crying as he explained how he had spent the last 4 years trying to convince himself that I was to blame for mom's death because he couldn't handle his own guilt. He said every time he looked at me, he saw mom's face and remembered how he had betrayed her. It was easier to blame me than to face what he had done. He revealed that he had married Sarah just 6 months after mom's death, partly because she had threatened to expose their affair to everyone if he didn't. She had apparently told him that people would be less likely to judge their relationship if they got married quickly, making it seem more like a love story and less like the sordid affair it was. Then came the part about the inheritance. Sarah had recently discovered my grandfather's fortune through some mutual business contacts. Dad said she had been the one pushing him to reconnect with me, meticulously planning everything from the LinkedIn message to the dinner at their house. She had even chosen what wine to serve and told him exactly what to say to make me feel comfortable. My grandfather, who had been quietly listening to all this, finally spoke up. He asked Dad one simple question: did you ever really want to reconcile with your daughter, or was it all about the money? My dad couldn't even look at me as he admitted that Sarah had orchestrated the whole thing. She had even written the LinkedIn message he sent me, saying it needed to sound casual but sincere. I couldn't take it anymore and left the room. The last thing I heard was my grandfather telling my dad that he was pathetic and that he had just lost his last chance at having any relationship with his daughter. My grandmother followed me out, holding me while I cried, not from sadness but from anger and disgust. Later that evening, things got even worse. I started receiving a series of texts from Sarah. The first few were angry, accusing me of destroying her marriage and threatening to sue me for recording their private conversation. But then they turned threatening. She said I had no idea who I was dealing with, that she had connections I couldn't imagine, and that she would make sure I regretted crossing her. The next morning, she sent me detailed information about my workplace, my apartment, and even my boyfriend's name and workplace. It was clearly meant to intimidate me, to show me that she could get to me if she wanted to. She ended her messages by saying that if I didn't convince my grandfather to change his will back, I would learn what it means to lose everything. I'm honestly scared now. Sarah comes from a wealthy family and seems to have connections everywhere. My dad is completely under her control, and they're both threatening to make my life miserable. My grandfather has hired a lawyer to protect me, but I'm worried about what they might do. They know where I work, where I live, and probably a lot more about my life. My boyfriend suggested I go to the police about Sarah's threats, but I'm not sure if they would take it seriously since she hasn't directly threatened physical harm. For now, I'm staying with my grandparents, and we're looking into getting restraining orders against both Sarah and my dad. I feel like I'm living in some kind of nightmare. Just when I thought I had finally moved past all the trauma of losing mom and being abandoned, everything has exploded again in the worst possible way. I'll update again if anything significant happens, but right now I'm just trying to figure out how to protect myself and my grandparents from whatever Sarah might be planning. Update 2. 3 months have passed since my last update, and things have taken a turn that none of us expected. Remember how Sarah threatened to sue me? Well, she actually went through with it. 2 weeks after my last update, I was served with legal papers at work. She was suing me for emotional distress and invasion of privacy, claiming $500,000 in damages. She also added defamation to the lawsuit after finding out I had shown the recording to my grandparents. The whole thing was humiliating. The process server walked right into my office during a team meeting and handed me the papers in front of all my colleagues. Within hours, the gossip had spread through the entire company. My boss was understanding about it, but I could tell some of my coworkers were uncomfortable around me after that. But Sarah's plan completely backfired. My grandfather's lawyer, Mr. Anderson, is apparently one of the best lawyers in our state, and he started digging into Sarah's background as part of our defense strategy. What he found was shocking, to say the least. Sarah had been married 3 times before my dad, and each marriage followed an eerily similar pattern. She would target wealthy married men, usually ones she met through work or social connections. She would start affairs with them, somehow their wives would find out, usually through anonymous tips, we now know, and their marriages would fall apart. Within months of their divorces, she would marry these men. But here's where it gets really interesting. All her previous marriages ended when her husbands mysteriously lost all their money through bad investments she had convinced them to make. These investments were always in overseas companies or complex financial schemes that promised huge returns. The lawyer dug deeper and discovered that Sarah was actually part of a sophisticated long con operation. She worked with a group of professional scammers who would help her identify potential targets. They would create elaborate backstories and fake businesses, set up situations for Sarah to meet these men, and then help her gain their trust. Once married, she would slowly convince her husbands to invest in their fake business ventures, effectively cleaning them out. Mr. Anderson found evidence linking Sarah to at least 5 other men besides her previous husbands who had lost significant amounts of money in similar schemes. He took all this information to the police, who it turns out were already familiar with several members of Sarah's con artist group. They had been trying to build a case against them for years but had never been able to connect Sarah to the operation. Our evidence was exactly what they needed. The police set up a sting operation, pretending to be interested investors in one of Sarah's current schemes. They gathered enough evidence over a few weeks to arrest her and several of her associates. When they raided her office, they found detailed files on all her previous targets, including my dad. They also found files on several potential future targets, wealthy married men she had been planning to approach. During the investigation, they discovered that my dad had already transferred most of his savings into various investments Sarah had recommended. These investments were all fake, and the money had been funneled into offshore accounts. He's now practically bankrupt, the mansion was actually rented, and most of their lavish lifestyle was funded by Sarah's previous cons. What really got to me was finding out that Sarah had started targeting my dad even before she met him. The police found a file on him dating back to before her first appearance at that company holiday party. She had researched his finances, his marriage with mom, and even me. She had been planning to destroy our family before she ever set foot in our house. The most painful part was learning that Sarah had actually engineered the revelation of her affair to my mom. That anonymous tip from her ex-husband? It was all part of her plan. She knew that exposing the affair would cause maximum emotional damage and make my mom more likely to demand a divorce, which would have given her easier access to dad's assets. Mom's death wasn't part of her plan, but she had used it to her advantage anyway, manipulating my dad's grief to rush into marriage. After Sarah's arrest, my dad tried to reach out to me again. He showed up at my grandparents' house, looking completely broken. He claimed he had no idea about Sarah's true nature and begged for my forgiveness. He said he wanted to start over and be a real father to me. He talked about how she had manipulated him when he was at his most vulnerable after mom's death, how she had isolated him from his family and friends, and how she had slowly taken control of his life. But I couldn't bring myself to trust him again. His actions 4 years ago weren't because of Sarah, they were his own choices. She might have manipulated him financially, but she didn't force him to have an affair while mom was alive. She didn't make him blame me for mom's death or abandon me when I needed him most. Those were his decisions. The police investigation is still ongoing, and they're trying to recover as much money as they can from Sarah's offshore accounts. My dad will probably never see most of his money again, but honestly, that seems like karma to me. He lost everything chasing a wealthy lifestyle with a woman who never really loved him, all while throwing away the family he already had. Update 3. It's been 6 months since Sarah's arrest, and a lot has happened. My dad has been sending me letters every week without fail. At first, they came to my grandparents' house, but when I moved back to my apartment, he somehow got that address too. Each letter is pages long, filled with apologies, explanations, and pleas for forgiveness. He's moved back to our hometown after losing the rented mansion and most of his possessions. He's now working as a sales manager at a local electronics store, quite a step down from his previous executive position, but it's all he could get after everything that happened. Most companies in his industry had heard about the scandal with Sarah, and no one wanted to hire him. In his letters, he writes about how sorry he is for everything, the affair with Sarah, blaming me for Mom's death, abandoning me when I needed him most. He talks about how he's been seeing a grief counselor to deal with his guilt over Mom's death and his role in it. He writes about how he thinks about me every day and how proud he is of everything I've achieved despite his absence. He's even started sending part of his salary to my grandparents every month, trying to repay them for taking care of me all these years. It's not much, maybe a few $100s each time, but my grandmother says she can tell he's really trying. She thinks he's genuinely changing, that losing everything has made him realize what really matters in life. My grandfather is less convinced. He says a leopard doesn't change its spots, and that Dad is only sorry because he got caught and lost everything. Last week, things came to a head when my dad showed up at my workplace during lunch break. He was barely recognizable from the man I knew 6 months ago. He's lost at least 30 pounds, his hair has gone completely gray, and he looked much older than his 45 years. His clothes, which used to be expensive suits, were now off the rack and slightly worn. I was having lunch with some coworkers when he walked into the cafeteria. He looked so lost and desperate that my coworkers actually felt sorry for him. He begged me to give him 5 minutes of my time. I agreed, mostly because I didn't want to cause a scene at work. We walked to a nearby park, and he broke down crying. He told me how Sarah had manipulated him from the very beginning, but he also acknowledged that his own weaknesses and choices had led to this situation. He admitted that blaming me for Mom's death was the worst thing he had ever done, and that he didn't expect forgiveness but wanted me to know how deeply he regretted his actions. He told me more about what happened after Mom's death, how he had spiraled into depression and alcoholism, how Sarah had seemed like a lifeline when he was at his lowest, and how she had slowly isolated him from everyone who cared about him. He said he knew now that she had targeted him specifically because of his vulnerable state, but that didn't excuse his actions. The most surprising part was when he pulled out an old photo from his wallet. It was from my 10th birthday, Mom, him, and me at the zoo, all of us smiling. He said he carries it with him every day now as a reminder of what he lost through his own actions. He said he looks at it whenever he feels sorry for himself, to remember that his choices didn't just ruin his life, they hurt the people he was supposed to love and protect. I listened quietly, but I couldn't feel anything for him. The dad in that photo, the one who used to take me to the zoo and help me with my math homework, died the day he chose to abandon me. This broken man in front of me was a stranger. When he finished talking, I told him I had to get back to work. He asked if he could keep writing to me, even if I never responded. I didn't answer him, just walked away. As I was leaving, I heard him call out, "I'm so proud of the woman you've become," even though I had nothing to do with it. That night, I took out all his letters and read them properly for the first time. Each one was different, but they all carried the same theme of regret and loss. In one particularly painful letter, he wrote about how he sometimes drives by our old house, now sold to another family, and sits in his car, remembering the life we used to have there. My grandmother says everybody deserves a second chance, but I'm not sure I can give him one. Some betrayals run too deep to heal. Update 4. It's been almost a year since this all started, and I've finally reached a decision about my relationship with my dad. After months of his attempts to reconnect, the letters, the workplace visit, the messages through family members, I sent him a final email yesterday. I spent weeks drafting it, wanting to make sure I said everything I needed to say. In the email, I told him that while I understand he's trying to make amends, some things can't be fixed. His betrayal of Mom through his affair with Sarah, blaming me for Mom's death, and abandoning me when I needed him most, these weren't just mistakes, they were conscious choices he made. Choices that revealed his true character. I explained how his abandonment affected me during those crucial years. How I had to go to therapy to deal with the trauma of losing both parents at once. How I struggled with trust issues in relationships because I was terrified of being abandoned again. How I had to learn to be strong and independent because I couldn't count on him. I told him about all the milestones he missed, my high school graduation, my first day of college, my college graduation, my first job. How my grandparents were there for every single one of those moments, cheering me on and supporting me. They became my real parents when he chose to walk away. I also addressed his recent attempts to make amends. I acknowledged that losing everything to Sarah's con must have been devastating, and that I believe he's genuinely sorry now. But I told him that his regret doesn't erase the past. His current struggles don't negate the pain he caused me. I wrote about how I've built a good life for myself, surrounded by people who genuinely care about me, my grandparents, my boyfriend, now fiancé, my friends, and my colleagues. I explained that I don't want or need his presence in my life anymore. The spot he once held in my heart has been filled by people who have proven themselves worthy of my trust and love. The hardest part was writing about Mom. I told him how I've kept her memory alive all these years, how I still visit her grave every month with fresh flowers, how I got a job in the same industry she worked in because I wanted to make her proud. I told him that his affair with Sarah didn't just destroy our family, it tainted many of my memories of my childhood, knowing now that he was betraying Mom even during what I thought were happy times. I ended the email by telling him to stop sending letters and to never contact me again. I explained that the father I loved died 4 years ago when he walked out on me, and I've already mourned that loss. I told him I hope he finds peace and happiness in his life, but it won't be as part of my life. After sending the email, I blocked his email address and phone number. I also asked my grandparents to stop updating me about him. They understood and respected my decision. My grandfather has officially changed his will, leaving everything to me. He says it's not just about the money, it's about making sure his legacy goes to someone who values family and loyalty over greed and selfishness. He's also set up a trust fund in Mom's name that will help underprivileged kids go to college. I'm at peace with my decision. My therapist says that forgiveness isn't always about reconciliation, sometimes it's about accepting what happened and choosing to move forward without that person in your life. That's what I'm doing now. Sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is accept that some people don't deserve a place in your life, even if they're family. I've learned that family isn't just about blood, it's about the people who stand by you through your darkest times and celebrate with you during your brightest moments.